represent the black St. Louis police officer who was injured by a white St. Louis police officer in what has been described, or was described last week, as a friendly fire incident. This is a story that's gotten way more press outside of St. Louis. In fact, it was in the New York Times yesterday. Way more press outside of St. Louis than it's gotten inside of St. Louis. You represent the officer who was shot. Tell us, Rufus, what's going on?
Well, let me qualify it just a little bit. The officer who was the shooting victim is a member of the Ethical Society of Police, and I'm a lawyer for that particular
I'm sorry,
union.
thank you. Okay.
All right. And so in that capacity, what we are doing at this particular stage is the union wants to make sure that a full and thorough investigation is done, and it is being handled by a specialized unit within the police department called the Force Investigative Unit, the FIU. That is a unit that's been in place for a little while to handle officer-involved shootings. And so that is the unit that will collect the physical evidence, the bullets, the guns. It would have been the unit that would take the drug tests of the officers involved in the shooting that night. It would be the one to conduct the interviews of those officers. And at the end of this process of their investigation, we expect there to be some conclusions to be drawn and to make sure the physical evidence actually matches up with what the oral testimonies of all the officers involved would be. Again, the physical evidence is going to be that sort of corroboration or calibration of what it is that people are saying did or did not happen out there. And so at this particular stage, we just want to make sure that that process plays itself out and that all I's are dotted, all T's are crossed. And because when people think of an African-American shooting victim, they're automatically thinking of some sort of civil litigation. Let me disabuse everyone of that notion at this stage. That is not presently within the contemplation of anyone within the union. It is way too preliminary for that kind of assessment to be made. We don't know what the raw facts are. And until we know what the raw facts are, all we are is a union making sure that one of the good guys in blue is treated as any other good guy in blue who had been the victim of a shooting has been treated in the past.
Rufus, can you
make sure that
And I think that's clear, at least in the articles that I've read and knowing you, that this is about fact gathering. But can you give the listeners just a summary of the facts? Because I think to understand why you're concerned about gathering all the facts, you have to understand what happened that evening.
Well, that's true. And what happened is on the night last week, the officers of a special unit, an undercover unit that involves in special crimes, was pursuing what they believed to be a stolen car. It was a stolen car occupied by several young teenage males. It was a high-speed pursuit. It wound up in a crash in front of the victim officer's house, not in front of his exact house, but in the neighborhood. And he was witness to that. The special unit cops came up shortly thereafter the crash. There was a shootout of sorts that took place. The officer, and one of the things that we need everyone to understand is that police officers in Missouri, all certified police officers in Missouri, are always on duty. In other words, they may not be in uniform, they may not be on the clock, but they are in an obligation to respond to any particular cause for crime. If they sense that there's crime, they are always, in effect, on duty.
So this officer was in his house. He hears a pursuit, a shootout, and he grabs his service revolver and goes to help those officers that are pursuing the suspects.
Correct. And one qualification is I'm not going to talk about the actual facts of what my officer may or may not say. I'll just say he was at his home.
Mm-hmm.
We'll put it like that. He's at his home. But yes, when he sees at least one of the males dashing down the side of his house, yes, he begins to engage, and he has his badge and his gun at the time he begins to engage. Now, of course, there are lots of people running around, and two officers order my guy to the ground because this is an unknown guy with a gun, at least at that time. Once they identify him, they see the badge, they recognize him, they authorize him to get up and to begin to approach them and to engage, or they would have been having him to engage with them. A third officer who was not a part of that initial encounter just runs up on the scene, and all we know is that there was a shot, and it hit the victim officer in his right arm, and those are the essential facts, and those are the facts that the police department has acknowledged at this stage.
So I'm going to take a statement from the New York Times article. The third officer, a white officer, came upon this scene and, according to the New York Times, stated, fearing for his safety, saw the off-duty black officer with a gun and fired a shot. Does that concern you that, once again, we hear this phrase, fearing for his safety, that a shot was fired at a black male?
In the abstract, it certainly, from the union's perspective, raises concerns. And there may be some plausible explanation for it, but that's what this force investigative unit, that's what they're tasked to do. And again, the question about whether or not it actually makes sense in the end or not depends upon several factors. What was the proximity of the shooter to the victim at the time of the shooting? What was the proximity of the shooter to the officers who had taken control of that scene at the time of the shooting? Was there anything obstructing his view? What was the lighting conditions like? Things like that have to be answered before you can make an assessment of whether or not it was reasonable to shoot at who turned out to be an officer under those circumstances. What, if anything, was said before the shooting occurred? Was there an order to stop, drop your weapon, get down? Was there anything like that that preceded this actual shooting? Until those facts are established by the FIU, no one, no officer, no lawyer is really in a position to make a reasonable conclusion about whether or not the circumstances justified the shooting at that time. Yes, the obvious optics of a white officer actually shoots a black officer. It raises question, it's good for the tabloids, but let's let the process work itself out, and let's see what the actual raw facts and physical evidence are in this case. And then the experts, the officers, the unions, the lawyers, can reach whatever reasonable conclusions there are under the circumstances. And at the end of the day, at this stage, the union is not taking an anti-police position because we are police. And so let's just let the police do what they do and conduct the investigation as they would any other officer who's been shot or wounded by a suspect or assailant. And we expect nothing less. And then after that's done, then we can proceed to see what needs to be done at that stage.
Rufus Tate, St. Louis attorney representing the Ethical Society. I'm sorry, the union is, Rufus?
The Ethical Society of Police.
Right. Talking about the shooting, I hope you, as the facts are gathered and we learn more, that we can get you back on to talk further about this.
I'd be happy.
Thank you so much. Rufus Tate, St. Louis lawyer, joining